pastor at Lutheran Church of the Good Shepherd. That is correct. In Minneapolis. I was afraid I was going to say that wrong. He is a graduate of St. Olaf College and Luther Seminary. He has his doctorate in theology, and his dissertation was in the Psalms, so we're very lucky to get his knowledge base this evening. And he has been a pastor at churches in California and Minnesota and Virginia, in addition to teaching at Augsburg for 6 years. Is that correct? So I'm going to let him do a little bit more introduction if he wants, and we're going to pray, and then I will have him come and speak. So please pray with me. Lord, we thank you for the opportunity to gather tonight and to hear this wonderful speaker and to grow in our knowledge of your word. Help us to apply what we learned tonight, that we might have a deeper understanding of the Psalms and turn to them in our hours of need, or our hours where we need comfort or just want to rejoice. And we thank you that our learning never stops, even during times when it's difficult to be together. So be with each one of us this evening. And in your blessed name we pray. Amen. Please welcome the Reverend Dr. Carl Jacobson.
It sounded like we were playing golf. Well, thank you, Chris, for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. I've actually taught Psalms at Bethel a number of years ago when I was still teaching at Augsburg. But that was downtown was that the retro site or the original site? How do you all talk about that?
Downtown. Yeah.
So it's fun to be back with you. Looking forward to it. We're going to do kind of a quick sprint. It's just 2 weeks, and I'm going to say a few words about how we're going to do this. There are a number of ways one could approach teaching by doing an overview of the Psalms. We could talk about the different types of Psalms, whether it's a psalm that is a prayer for help or a hymn of praise, wisdom. So we could talk about type. We could talk about get really invested in the structure of the book. That's another way some folks would go at it. But one of the things that struck me recently as I've been digging around in the Psalms is how often we get this kind of either-or proposition. That's how the book starts. Psalm 1 talks about, blessed is the one who meditates on the law of the Lord, and that person will be like a tree planted by a stream, strong, healthy, bearing fruit in due season. On the other hand, folks who don't meditate on God's law, who don't love God's will, are going to be sort of like an unhealthy plant and dry up and they'll be blown away. So Psalm 1 sets up the whole book as sort of this either-or. As I've put it, things can go kind of one of two ways. And that happens frequently in the Psalms, as I think we'll see. So in our 2 weeks, here's what we're going to do. The first week, tonight, we'll do just an overview. We'll talk about what a psalm is. We'll talk about the nature of the collection. We'll talk a little bit about how to read a psalm. And by that, I mean the basic building block of Hebrew poetry. And then broadly, just say a word or two about lament and praise as kind of the poles of the Psalms. And then next week, we're going to do this series of 2 different ways of thinking about things. So the ways of the wicked and the righteous, the ways of the past and the present, and the ways of fear and faith. So that's our 2 weeks. I'll try not to move too fast. You may feel free to interrupt if you have a question at any time. I think that's important. If you have a question, chances are good somebody else is wondering the same thing. So, okay. What are the Psalms? As I said, they're poems. And in some ways, that's the most important thing to say about the Psalms. They are not like other literature in the Bible. They're not like narrative or prose. They aren't legal regulations, although there is legal material in the Psalms. They aren't the same as prophecy, which is also poetic in form, but the Psalms are more clearly poetic. So that's the first thing to say. And just, you're here so you're interested, or you're watching from home and you're interested. But I think people are often afraid of the Psalms, even as much as they love them, because a lot of folks say, I don't know how to read And the truth of the matter is, yes, you do. You just don't know that you know how to read poetry. And so we'll talk a little bit about the particularities of Hebrew poetry in a bit. Many of the Psalms are attributed to David, and we'll talk about that a little bit, maybe down the line. But it's important to know that of the 150 Psalms, a huge number of them are attributed to David. Can anybody tell me how many? And Chris, you don't get to answer because you probably know already, plus you looked at my PowerPoint before, so you know the answer.
101?
Pardon me?
101?
Not quite that many. Sorry, you don't have to venture a guess if you don't want to. It's actually 73. So almost half of the Psalms are attributed to David. And that's why they actually get referred to, the whole collection gets referred to as David in the New Testament. Here's the example. From Hebrews 4:7, the author of Hebrews is talking about God's plan and says, God sets a certain day, today, saying through David much later, in the words already quoted, today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts. That quotation comes from Psalm 95, where the psalmist says, for he is our God, and we are the people of his pasture, the sheep of his hand. Oh, that today you would listen to his voice. Do not harden your hearts as at Meribah, as on the day at Massah in the wilderness. Now, the reason this is an illustration of how the New Testament calls the Psalms David is that this psalm is actually not attributed to David. It has no title at the beginning, which then suggests that the whole collection is understood as really belonging to David, whether or not he wrote them or not. Just one other quick aside about this quotation. Notice that in Hebrews, the quotation actually goes across two verses. In Psalm 95, the very end of verse 7 and beginning of verse 8 are what is quoted, which the only reason I share that with you is, we'll talk more about this shortly, but the verse numbers that we use in the Bible are not original. They were added quite a bit later for reference purposes. And we're not, there are some pretty clear divisions, but the numbers really don't matter all that much. So, if you love John 3:16 because it's 3 and 16, I'm sorry. It just doesn't matter. Okay. So, first things first, just a few words about terminology. The Psalter is another way of talking about the collection. And it's derived really from the word psalm. And that word comes to us from the Greek. The Greek word for a song of praise is psalmos, psalm. And that's different than the Hebrew words that get used. So a common description of a psalm in Hebrew is mizmor, and that simply means a melody of some kind. But there, the Hebrew Bible's term for the collection is tehillim, which means praises. So even though not every psalm is a praise psalm, and in fact, most of them aren't, the collection as a whole, that's how it's understood, at least in the Old Testament. Just for clarity, when referring to a reading from the book of Psalms, you don't say Psalms 12. You quote the actual psalm, Psalm 12. Or if you're going to talk about multiple psalms, then you make it plural. So Psalms is the collection, but you don't refer to the collection in the title. And this is, I still use this. I had to teach this when I taught at Augsburg because it drove me nuts when students would, as it says in Psalms 12, my heart would palpitate. And then just so you're clear, if you're reading sometime, when you're talking about a psalm or psalms in a general sense, you don't capitalize the P. You only capitalize it if you're boring stuff out of the way. So the Psalter, the book of Psalms, is actually a book of books. It's a collection of collections. And it's actually divided out that way in the way it's laid out on the pages. And this has been the case for a long, long time. So there are 5 different books. They are not the same length. You know, you'd think with 150 Psalms divided by 5, the books could be of equal length. That's not how it works. And the reason for that is it's a collection of collections. And so the books that we have grouped together, so Psalms 1 through 41, for example, most of those are attributed to David. Similarly, a number of the Psalms in Book 2 are David. And so there were probably some smaller, what we would call Davidic collections of Psalms. And it goes even farther than that. For example, as I said, Psalms 3 through 41, we get David's Psalms, but then there are a number of Psalms attributed to another author, one of the singers in the temple, whose name was Korah. There's another collection, interestingly divided up in sort of a strange way. Psalm 50 and Psalms 73 through 83 are attributed to a group of, again, temple musicians called the Sons of Asaph. And just as an aside, the Psalms of Asaph, that's what I did my dissertation work on. You'll get a little taste of that next week. And then another collection is what are called the Songs of Ascent, Psalms 120 through 134. And the reason they were called the Songs of Ascent is that they were frequently used as people would make a pilgrimage to the temple. And so wherever one lived in Israel, you'd go down before you started going up to the holy city and up to the Temple Mount. And these psalms were, as we understand, prayed frequently on those pilgrimages. So the Songs of Ascent going up to the temple. Another striking thing about books 1 and 2 is that they may well have formed an earlier collection, because at the end of Psalm 72, we get this phrase, "The prayers of David, son of Jesse, are ended," which suggests that for at least a time that was the collection, or a primary collection. There's also a theory that's pretty popular among Psalms scholars that Psalms 1 through 119 were an original collection. And the reason for that is that you get a couple of structural things. Psalms 1 and 119 are Torah psalms. They laud God's law and how important it is for us to make that a part of our lives. And what's more, Psalm 2 and Psalm 118 are both royal psalms, having to do with the life of Israel's king, God's chosen, anointed one. And so the idea is that you get those two bookends to the collection that kind of bracket all of those psalms in between. And they do two things. They emphasize studying God's law, but they also emphasize messianic expectation. One of the things that is frequently quoted from Martin Luther about the book of Psalms is that he said we could consider the Psalter a little Bible. And in fact, if we didn't have anything else, if we just had the Psalms, that would be enough because they promise Christ's death and resurrection so clearly. Now, some people hear that and they say, come on, there's no way that the authors of the Psalm had Jesus in mind when they wrote them. But what's clear is in early Judaism, in the folks who ended up living around the Dead Sea, where the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, and also the authors of the New Testament, they all read the Psalms with messianic expectation at work. They believed that the Psalms promised this ideal king that was to come. Now, the way that plays itself out, of course, ends up a little different, but it was a common way of reading the Psalms. So the book of Psalms have these two pieces, at least in this early collection, 1 through 119, talking about God's word and the the expectation that the Messiah would be coming. There's more. In books 2 and 3, Psalms 42 through 89, there's a preference for the word Elohim, which is the Hebrew word for God. It's not God's name. And it prefers that over the actual use of God's name, which is Yahweh. And you can see that in some parallel psalms, it appears that changes were made. So you might have had an original psalm that had the name Yahweh in it, and that was removed and replaced with God. Why would that be the case?
Well, it was against the rule to say his name except once a year, I guess, wasn't it?
And it's only the high priest who can say it in the Holy of Holies, because to invoke God's name in that way was it was such a sacred enterprise that the possibility that we might abuse God's name was so serious, right, that it just isn't said. And in fact, among devout Jews to this day, the name is never spoken. Which is why in many, if not most, English translations of the Bible, you get the word Lord with all capitals. So it's a capital L and then small capitals O-R-D. Have you ever noticed that? Next time you're reading along in the Old Testament, watch for that. Because you get the name Lord or the word Lord all over the place. But that's a substitute for where the Bible uses God's name. And so that somebody reading out loud wouldn't come across the divine name and speak it and risk blasphemy. So in English translations, it's usually done out of respect for devout Jews who might be picking up that text. Okay, and again, as I said, you get this shifting going on in what is called the Elohistic, for Elohim, Psalter, and you get some parallels or doubling of Psalms. So Psalm 14 and Psalm 53 are the same. It's the exact same psalm with a couple of minor changes, minor differences. Similarly, Psalm 40, at least a part of it, is repeated in Psalm 70. So that shows, or suggests at least, that there were different collections of psalms that were at use, and then eventually they all get pulled together into our current collection of 150. And again, this is a little repetitious, I'm sorry, but at the Dead Sea Scrolls, much of this is seen. You actually get the collection of the Song of Ascents. There's one scroll that has just the Song of Ascents, and then there are other examples of this. All right, questions so far about the sort of the book and the collection of collections?
Well, there was music. What about the music?
Yeah, the problem is we know relatively little about what the music actually was. There are some theories, and there have been some reconstructions, but a number of the technical terms that are used in the Psalms, we really don't know what they actually mean. Some are melodies, apparently. Some are instruments, clearly. So a particular psalm might have been meant to be recited to a tambourine, for example. We don't know exactly what it was like. Certainly they were sung. Probably not always, but there was definitely music involved. Other questions? Okay. So just briefly, the anatomy of a psalm. The numbers, as I said, were not original. No one sat down and said, I'm feeling like 3 today. 3. This is a 3-ish sort of psalm, I'm going to write, of course. I'm being facetious. But the numbering of the psalms and the verse numbers were added later. And in fact, the verse numbering that we use in our Bibles today actually dates to the hymn writing pastors in England. Who am I thinking of? The Wesleys. The current numbering is based on their work. So it's really quite late in terms of its final development. And that's why sometimes you'll see, and this happens in the New Testament as well, in English Bibles as they're laid out, sometimes the last verse in a chapter gets attached to the next chapter. Because it's clear from the logistics that, for whatever reason, they put the break in the wrong spot. But we stick with it. Another thing that's important to know is that what are called the superscriptions, so this little title, again, the consensus, not everybody agrees, but the broad consensus in Psalms studies is that the superscriptions were added later. They were not original to all of the Psalms. That doesn't mean that none of the superscriptions were original, but that many of them were added. And probably all of the ones that have a specific moment from the life of David. So this psalm, when David fled from his son Absalom. The theory is that those superscriptions are added so that the psalm can be used as a part of a larger telling of David's story. I don't know if that's right or wrong. It's interesting. But I do think it's pretty clear that in a number of cases, the addition of what are called the superscriptions they're not original. And so I would say as you read those, don't worry too much about them. Don't get wrapped up in what that, especially some of them are quite long and they're not necessarily helpful. The body of the psalm, we'll talk about what makes up a psalm sort of as we go along, but I want to point out two things here. First is this word Selah, which means we don't know. We literally don't know what the word means. And so one of the suggestions is, because of the way it gets inserted in a number of psalms, it may well be like stanzas in a hymn. So after the second verse, you're supposed to maybe start the tune over, go back to the beginning. Maybe it's pause, just a total pause. What's important to notice here is that you get Selah after verse 2, you get it again after 4. You're expecting it at 6, but it's not there. And then it's at the end of the psalm as well, where you might think, why would you need to be told this is the end of a stanza? Because it's over. So it's one of those pesky things in psalm studies that we really wish we knew what it meant, and we don't. So I apologize for just, I'm showing you the emperor's new clothes of the whole discipline. Hope that's not frustrating. Okay, let's talk about the poetry of the Psalms. When you think poetry, what's the first thing that comes to mind? Rhyming. I would say that is the standard, at least in Western poetry. What about Japanese poetry? What's the key there, or at least one of them? Yeah, syllables. If you think of haiku, right, that's the most familiar, at least, Japanese poetry. But even there, it's not just syllables. In traditional haiku, there needs to be a reference to plant life and the season. So that's why at the end of haiku you often get, lotus blossoms in August. And I'm only sharing that part because in college I was an Asian studies major and I just have no use for it. So I sprinkle it in the Psalms. So we tend to think, when we think poetry, rhyming, syllables, meter, that sort of thing. And Hebrew poetry has almost none of that. Hebrew poetry doesn't work with rhyme or meter. If there's a rhyme, it's probably an accident. And there's only one kind of psalm that may have some metrical elements to it, and it's a lament psalms. And the meter is called kina, and it has to do with the rhythm of saying something that is a complaint or a lament over suffering or perhaps mourning. Think in the Gospels of Jesus goes to the house of the official. He's going to, his daughter is ill, Jairus' daughter is ill. Jesus goes and he is too late. And the mourners and the flute players are already there. And probably they were keen. That's where that word is borrowed from. So what is it that makes Hebrew poetry poetry? We'll skip that piece. The basic building block of Hebrew poetry is what is called parallelism, or you might say repetition. Here are just 4 examples. In Psalm 8, what are human beings that you are mindful of them, mortals that you care for them? Again, in Psalm 108, I will give thanks to you, O Lord, among the peoples. I will sing praises to you among the nations. 83, O God, do not keep silence. Do not hold your peace, or be still, O God. And then lastly, 85, you forgave the iniquity of your people. You pardoned all of their sin. In each of those verses, there are parallel concepts going between the 2 lines. So, you get human beings and mortals. God is mindful of them. God cares for them. Again, in 108, thanks and praise are parallel concepts, peoples and nations. Keeping silence, holding peace, or being still, and so on. This is the standard. And in fact, there's almost not a verse in the book of Psalms that doesn't have some form of parallelism. There are some, but it's very rare. Parallelism is all over the place. And so as you read through a psalm on your own, this is probably the most important thing to know, that what the psalm is going to do is it's going to repeat or echo, or you also get a different kind of parallelism, which is antithesis, right? Where it'll say, for example, the wicked and the righteous. Those are actually parallel concepts, even though they're opposite of each other. So parallelism is the basic building block. It occurs in a number of different ways. First, it can occur within a line, a half verse of a poem. So, the Lord is my light and my salvation. The parallel concepts there are light and salvation. The Lord is, in Psalm 145, gracious and merciful. Those, again, are held in tandem. So, parallelism can occur within a line of Hebrew poetry. It can also occur between lines. And this is really the standard. So we saw that in the first 4 examples. But Psalm 139 asks the question, where can I go from your spirit? Where can I flee from your presence? So go and flee, spirit and presence, and so on. So excuse me. I don't know if that's bugging you. I need to either stand still, or which I can't do. This parallelism between lines in the psalm is, again, it's the standard. It can also occur, though, between verses. Consider Psalm 3. O Lord, how many are my foes? Many are rising against me. Many are saying to me, there is no help for you in God. The parallelism here is, foes is sort of the overarching idea. And you get something very specific here. People who rise against the person praying and then speak against the person praying. And the setting here might well be in a courtroom kind of setting, which would have happened in the gate of the city, where the psalmist's enemies are gathered to make accusations with me so far? All right, so parallelism, that's the basic thing you're going to want to look for. Now, for fun, I thought we could look at Psalm 23, the predictable psalm of choice, I suppose. I'd like to have us do a couple of things. Read through it together, and I want you to think about how the psalm is meaningful to you personally. Then we're going to talk about how the parallelism works and how it creates meaning through its poetry. So we'll read it together. I'll read it, and then back this up. I'll read it for those of us here and at home. And again, you're thinking about what the psalm means to you, and I'm going to ask you to share some of that. And then we'll try to identify the parallelism and how the psalm actually functions. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in right paths for his name's sake. Even though I walk through the darkest valley, I fear no evil. For you are with me, your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil, my cup overflows. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life. And I shall dwell in the house of the Lord my whole life long. How is this psalm meaningful for you? Maybe I shouldn't assume. Is this psalm meaningful for you?
Well, I would say, like, for me, even, like, this has been said at every family funeral we've ever had. And especially the number 4, even though I walk through the darkest valley, I fear no evil, for you're with me. That is out, and your rod and staff, they comfort me. That has always helped me feel safe, like God is there with me, and like that one itself has always comforted me. I don't know why. Because I just always feel like that God is always there. And even though our life goes up and down and we travel on these roads that bring us different paths, he's always still there for me. And no matter what, God is there.
Yeah, thank you. And I would say that reason for, or drawing that meaning from this psalm at a funeral is precisely what it's intended to do. Looking at the last verse, I will dwell in the house of the Lord my whole life long. People often take that and think, oh, this is a promise about the person who has died. And it's okay to have that reaction to it, but it's not what the psalm actually means or intends. The house of the Lord is the temple. And this idea is that for those of us who now are experiencing this dark valley, and actually I just have to say, I think the old translation is better. The NRSV shifted away from talking about the valley of the shadow of death, but that's actually what the Hebrew means, in my opinion. It's a place where death and darkness are. So, but the idea is that even when we're there, we have a refuge in God's temple, or in the house of the Lord here at Bethel. That's the promise that the psalm is making. Good. So, sorry. Other.
Well, the comfort, yes, but I think the Psalms, well, this Psalm, or like Psalm 91, have power.
So the psalm has power. Say more about that.
And there's power there to protect us. If you believe it, not, it's just.
Yeah, thank you. In my mind's eye, somebody's at home screaming at the screen. I hope that's true. How meaningful this is for Post-On.
The language is very serene.
Serene language.
Yeah, it's very calm, very, like when you're in the woods, it's by a lake, it's very quiet and calm and peaceful.
sure, I mean, that's the imagery that's driving it, right? The assumption is that we are the sheep. Yeah. And so when the shepherd's taking care of the sheep, where do the sheep end up? In serene, safe, protected places. So, on the one hand, oops, I did not, there we go. So, on one hand, you get the shepherd's actions, right? Makes me lie down, leads me. And then you can even take it into verse 3, restores. Those are all parallels. There's the place bit too, right? That it's pastures and still waters, right pathways. That sort of constant repetition, yes, but also expanding of the idea. That's how the poetry functions. And again, you get the imagery in verse 4, the shepherd imagery of the shepherd's rod and staff. Well, I'd say that's good. But I want to show you something about this psalm, as familiar as it is, that I'm willing to bet, unless all those years ago you were in the Psalms class I did at Bethel, because I use this bit every time I teach Psalm 23. So, another poetic device that is used in Hebrew poetry very commonly is called gematria or gematria. It's numerology, which is totally lost on us in translation. So that's why I don't even bother with it most of the time. But here's what I want you to see. So this is the Hebrew name for God. And in Hebrew is written right to left. So this is Y, H, in this case W, H, Yahweh. In Hebrew, the numeric value of God's name is based on each letter. And so 26 is the number of the divine name. On here, I stepped on this earlier. So that's just a reminder of where Lord comes in.
Yahweh, Yah, and Wah are the same letter?
So, okay, you're going to do a deep dive Hebrew for a second, so bear with us. Hebrew is originally written without vowels.
Right.
It's a purely consonantal language. With one exception, you get occasionally consonants that are meant to tell you there's a specific vowel that you need here. You need to know it. Later, what's called vowel pointing, and I've got more Hebrew coming, and I'll show you what the vowel pointing looks like in a minute. The vowels get added in, which is actually, and I have no intention of going here tonight, but it's actually where the word Jehovah comes from. Jehovah is a nonsense word. It is not God's name. Because the name Yahweh, in Hebrew text, to help people not pronounce it, one of two things was done when vowel pointing was added. Either they didn't add the vowels to the divine name, so you'd come to it and not know what to say, or they put the vowels for a different word, so you would mispronounce it. And so actually the divine name Yahweh in Hebrew, the Hebrew version of the Bible, gets the letters for the word Lord, Adonai. And then when you put those together, what you get is the word Jehovah. So if the Jehovah's Witnesses come to your door sometime, you can dazzle them with that. That's not nice. All right, with this in mind, back to Psalm 23. Here is Psalm 23 in Hebrew. And now you can see, let me find that. Well, so all of these little dots and lines, those are vowels and then accent points and that kind of thing. So remember what I said about superscriptions. Superscriptions are added later. With that in mind, we take the first two words, which are in Hebrew Mizmor LeDavid, a psalm of David, and we take them off. And instead, we just start with, here's Yahweh with vowels. Yet, va, essentially. Now, another thing you need to know about Hebrew words is that, where'd it go? See this little dash that I'm pointing at? That's called a mepheg, and that means bridle. And it means it's two separate words, but they're yoked together here. It's a hyphen. But if we ignore the mepheg, ignore the hyphen, and we start counting words, here's what we get. 26 words, and then you get a phrase in Hebrew, which I'll come back to, and then you get another 26 words. So numerically centered in this psalm is a phrase. And in Hebrew, I overdid it on the slide, I apologize. I forgot. So here it is in English. And it's a little rough because, translating from Hebrew to English, you can't always keep the words in exactly the same spot. But roughly, here are the 26 words, that centered phrase for "you are with me," and 26 words. What's going on here is the centering claim of the psalm, which you nailed beautifully. The promise, "for you are with me." As the psalmist prays to God, that is the key to it all. Telling God, "for you are with me." And so the numerical value of the name of the Lord, 26, gets us to this phrase, "for you are with me," which reminds us of what? And that's bad teaching, to fish for an answer, and there's only one right answer. So I'm not going to wait for you to try to figure out where my head is going. It gets us to Emmanuel, which is the promise made in Isaiah and taken up in the New Testament, that God is with us. That is going to be the Messiah's name. And you can take it up with your pastors as to why they named him Jesus then. That's a whole different conversation. So it's also, along those lines, I think it's no mistake that Jesus calls himself the Good Shepherd, and then describes what the Good Shepherd does in that way. That God's presence with us is for protection. It's for safety and assurance. It is core to who God is, and core to our relationship with God, that God is present. Ours is a God who shows up. All right, I'm going to just stop for a second. It's too bad that Psalm 23 isn't actually the 26th Psalm. That would be perfect. But it's not. So, questions, comments, thoughts, anecdotes?
Well, then there's the acrostic thing. I guess that's a strange thing.
Yeah, and again, so it's not uncommon. Not a lot of the Psalms are acrostic, but several of them are. And they're alphabetic acrostics. That's the primary way. So each verse starts with a consecutive letter of the alphabet. And then there's Psalm 119, which we might call the mother of all alphabetic acrostics, because it has 8 verses that all start with consecutive letters. So 8 A's, 8 B's, and so on. But again, it's impossible to bring them into English and get that. You would just have to totally distort the meaning to start it that way. All right, one more little piece, and then we can stop for just general questions or reactions to whether it's anything we've talked about tonight or just questions that you've had about the Psalms in general. One of the 2 ways that we get, and in this case it's actually both ways in the Psalms. We get both lament and praise. Lament, complaint, prayer for help, however you want to label them, they make up about a third of the Psalms are cries for help. And what's interesting is that in the 150 Psalms, those laments are bunched in the beginning. That doesn't mean there aren't laments Psalms in books 3, 4, and 5. There are, but the majority of them are at the beginning of the book. And conversely, most of the praise hymns are at the end. And in fact, if you go and start looking in the mid-140s, it is just this barrage of praises that end the book. Old school, well-known psalm scholar, German guy named Klaus Westermann, has suggested that the shift from lament and complaint to praise and thanksgiving is what the book is laid out to help us navigate. If we're reading the book, beginning to end, that's how we get moved from complaint to praise. It's also important to notice, though, that in a complaint psalm, there's always an element of trust, even if it's really short and minor. Because trusting God enough to yell at God and complain to God and cry out, as Job learned, that's the key to it. Not to keep it's very not Lutheran, frankly, and we need to shift this in our tradition, I think. But we don't need to just be stoic and pack it in. We're told if we're angry, if we're hurting, we're supposed to take that to God and let God know, and that is actually an act of trust. And in the book of Job, the whole thing ends. Job has, as one of my favorite phrases in Job, he's filled his mouth with arguments, and he's gone to God and hollered at God. And God turns around and says, you're wrong, knock it off. That's a perfect summary of Job. And then Job's friends are there, who've been getting after him, trying to help him figure out what he did wrong to get punished this way. And God tells them, no, Job has spoken correctly. Even though Job is wrong, he has spoken correctly because he takes it directly to God. That's an act of faith, even in the midst of complaint. So, at any rate, in individual psalms, but also the book as a whole, there is this movement along these two different pathways. And it's okay to be on one road for a while, but in the long run, the shift is for us to be in the praise lane. And then just lastly, I'll say, Elie Wiesel, the well-known Holocaust survivor, told the story of a rabbi, a friend of his in the camps, who chose not to, when Yom Kippur, which we just had recently, rolled around, he wasn't going to fast. He was not going to observe anything for Yom Kippur. And their exchange around that ends up where Wiesel thinks his friend has totally lost his faith. Later on then, in fact just days before his friend Pinchas was his name, was going to be executed, Wiesel tells him he's going to worship. And Pinchas says to him, well, say the Kaddish for me, the hymn of praise. And Wiesel says, well, why do you want me to do that when you've lost your faith? And Pinchas says, sometimes the only way to accuse God is by praising him. Which I just think is beautiful. And it's very much out of the Psalms. All right, questions, reactions.
Actually, can you tell if there's questions on the feed?
Sorry, they don't want me to comment on the thing. Just give me 1 second, please.
They may not, because they may not know we're checking it, but I just like the book. Why did you pick the Psalms for your
Sorry,
dissertation?
like a YouTube's not showing up on the Facebook.
Yeah, well, it's, the question for folks at home is why did I choose the Psalms for my dissertation? And the answer is really two-part. One, my father, who was a pastor, when I was in junior high, did his one sabbatical, and he studied the Psalms, and then when he got back to his congregation, did a Bible study within a preaching series as well. And I was moved by it, even as a junior high kid. I just thought the Psalms were really interesting. And then, in terms of our emotions, when I was in grade school and junior high, we had a pretty serious family illness going, and I was confused. I was, okay, in the simplistic worldview of a kid, I thought, well, my parents are good people, my dad's a pastor, why is this happening? It doesn't make any sense. And the Psalms were what helped me navigate that not at the time, that came later, but it helped me navigate my emotional stuff in relationship to God. So when I was in graduate school, I thought, this is what I need to know more of and about.
How did the Asian studies fit into that?
How did Asian studies fit into that? It didn't. My original plan, my plan for my life was going to graduate from St. Olaf. I was close to doing a stint in the Marines, and then I was going to go into the Foreign Service. That was my plan. So it was going to be St. Olaf service, and then ideally end up at the Language Academy, the military language. Yep. That's what I